The night stretched out in front of me like a vast, unbroken void. The asphalt shimmered faintly under the moonlight, an endless ribbon winding through a desolate landscape. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating patches of cracked pavement and the occasional road sign. The hum of the engine was my only companion, a low, rhythmic reminder of the solitude surrounding me. I'd been driving for hours, chasing some undefined sense of escape or purpose. There was no particular destination in mind, just a road and the night, a perfect duo for drowning out the noise of my own thoughts. The world seemed to have paused, as if I were the only person left awake, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The occasional rustle of the wind cutting across the car broke the monotony, but even that felt distant, disconnected. I caught myself glancing at the dashboard clock. The glowing numbers informed me it was well past midnight, but they failed to tell me why I was still out here. My mind was a tangle of unanswered questions and unspoken fears, all of them seeking refuge in the emptiness of this stretch of road. The surroundings offered little to distract me. Endless fields of tall grass swayed under the faint breeze, their shadows shifting like restless spirits. There were no streetlights, no towns in sight, just the occasional clump of trees casting eerie silhouettes against the horizon. I kept telling myself this was just another long drive, but something about the stillness tonight felt different. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if bracing for something I couldn't name. Perhaps it was the darkness itself, pressing in too closely, or the way the road seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. The sound of my own breathing began to compete with the engine's hum, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I had myself to contend with. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. What if I just stopped the car here? No destination, no expectations, just me and the infinite night. But the absurdity of the idea made me shake my head. I couldn't stop. Some primal need to keep moving, urged me forward, though I wasn't sure whether it was courage or cowardice driving that instinct. The miles melted away beneath my tires, and with them, the remnants of my earlier resolve. My focus wavered, eyes occasionally darting to the shadows on either side of the road, half expecting them to move. The silence was no longer comforting. It began to feel oppressive, as if the night itself was watching me. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't just an ordinary drive. It happened so suddenly that for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. A figure appeared in the distance, standing just at the edge of the road. My heart jolted as my headlights caught her, a woman, standing still, one arm raised in a hesitant wave. Her silhouette was almost ghostly against the backdrop of the night. She was wearing a pale dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her posture was rigid, almost unnatural. As I got closer, I could make out more details. Her face, pale and drawn, and her hair, tangled as if she'd been battling the wind for hours. I instinctively slowed down, the car's engine softening to a low purr. My fingers tightened on the wheel as questions raced through my mind. What was she doing out here, alone, at this hour? There were no cars, no signs of a breakdown, just her, standing on the roadside like she'd been waiting. The faint hope that maybe she was just lost, that this was some harmless coincidence, fought against a deeper unease rising in my chest. Her hand stayed raised, though the motion lacked urgency. It was as if she already knew I'd stop. I was close enough now to see her face more clearly. Her eyes locked onto mine through the windshield, and a chill ran through me. There was something off about the way she looked, not frightened, not desperate, just hollow. I pulled the car to a hesitant stop a few feet away from her. She didn't move, just stood there, waiting. My foot hovered over the pedal for a moment, considering whether to drive away. But something about her lonely figure tugged at me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. I rolled down the window, my voice breaking the fragile silence. "Do you need help?" Her lips moved, but at first, no sound came out. Then, she nodded slowly and whispered, "Please." I hesitated. My hand hovered over the gear shift, and for a brief moment, The engine's hum was the only sound between us. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to avoid whatever this was. Yet, there was something about her, fragile, desperate, that wouldn't let me turn away. She stood there, unmoving, illuminated by the glow of my headlights. The loneliness etched on her face struck a chord deep within me, even as unease prickled at the back of my neck. I took a deep breath, trying to quiet the gnawing doubt in my mind. "All right," I muttered to myself, barely audible. I leaned over and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in," I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. She hesitated for just a moment, then moved toward the car. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if each step cost her an enormous effort. When she opened the door and slid into the seat beside me, the cold air that followed her seemed to linger, making the small cabin feel suffocating. As I glanced at her again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might have just made a terrible mistake. She closed the door with a soft click, her hands resting awkwardly in her lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, the kind that felt like it could burst under its own weight. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet, almost too quiet. I glanced at her briefly, trying to gauge her expression. Her face was pale, and her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she were holding back a flood of words. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, though my pulse was anything but calm. "To the next town," she replied, her words clipped. "If you could just drop me there, that would be enough." Her voice was soft, but carried a tremor that hinted at something she wasn't saying. I nodded, fixing my eyes back on the road as I shifted into gear. "All right, it's not far." She gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she repeated. I tried to shake off the tension, gripping the wheel a little too tightly as the car rolled forward. Small talk felt like the natural thing to do, something to break the odd tension hanging in the air. "Were you out there long?" I asked, glancing at her again. Her response came after a delay, her eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. "Long enough," she said, her tone flat, devoid of detail. I waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, her hands fidgeted in her lap, fingers brushing against the fabric of her dress. I noticed how pristine her nails were, neatly trimmed and clean, a small detail that felt out of place given the disheveled state of the rest of her. "You're lucky I came by," I said lightly, trying to mask my own nervousness. Not many cars take this road at this time of night. For the first time, she looked at me directly. Her gaze was piercing, almost too intense, and it sent a chill through me. "Yes," she said softly, a strange edge to her voice. "Very lucky." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, letting the hum of the engine fill the silence once again. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about her felt off, like there was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before she got in. She turned her gaze back to the road, and I was left with the sinking feeling that whatever she wasn't saying might be the most important thing of all. The minutes dragged on, the car filled with an unbearable quiet. Her presence felt heavier with each passing second, though she hardly moved. She sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands now clasped tightly in her lap. I couldn't decide if she was scared or simply trying to keep herself together. I tried to focus on the road, but my eyes kept darting to her. There was something unsettling about the way she stared straight ahead, unblinking, as though she wasn't looking at the road but through it. "You okay?" I finally asked, the question escaping before I could stop myself. "Yes," she said quickly, almost too quickly, but her voice was hollow, and her eyes remained fixed on the dark horizon. The silence returned, thicker than before. I wanted to ask her more questions, where she was coming from, what had happened, but something in her demeanor warned me against it. Instead, I turned my attention to the faint rhythm of the tires against the asphalt, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. Yet, no matter how much I tried to rationalize, I couldn't ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It was as if the air itself had changed since she entered the car, colder, heavier. I flicked a glance her way again. Her expression hadn't shifted, But I noticed her hands trembling slightly, her knuckles white from how tightly she gripped them together. "You sure you're all right?" I asked again, this time softer, more carefully. She hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, but then she shook her head, almost imperceptibly. "Just keep driving," she murmured. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to press her, to understand what was going on, but I swallowed the impulse. The unease was becoming unbearable, and I found myself wishing desperately for the next town to appear. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional creak of the car and the whisper of wind outside. Every now and then, I caught myself stealing glances at her, each time hoping to catch some sign of normalcy, some indication that I hadn't made a terrible mistake by stopping. But each time, I found nothing, just that same distant stare, that same impenetrable silence. And with every passing mile, the feeling grew stronger. I wasn't driving her somewhere. I was being led. I couldn't stop noticing the little things. At first, they seemed inconsequential. Her dress, for instance, while torn in places, looked oddly clean, almost pristine. There were no signs of dirt or grime, nothing that suggested she'd been wandering along the roadside for long. Her hands were another thing. Trembling, yes, but they didn't have the scratches or marks you'd expect from someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. It didn't add up. I stole another glance at her. She still hadn't moved much, her body rigid, eyes fixed ahead. My chest tightened with the realization that I might have picked up someone who wasn't being entirely truthful. "You're sure you're okay?" I asked again, my voice barely masking the edge of suspicion creeping into it. She hesitated, just for a moment before answering. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice low and mechanical. But I didn't believe her. Something about her seemed carefully rehearsed, as though she were choosing each word with painstaking precision. My thoughts raced as I tried to piece together an explanation. Maybe she'd been in an accident. Maybe she was running from someone. Or maybe she wasn't running at all. The uneasy silence stretched on until I couldn't bear it anymore. "Were you out there alone?" I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Her head turned slightly, just enough for me to catch her profile in the dim light of the dashboard. "Yes," she said, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. The air inside the car seemed to grow colder. My pulse quickened, though I tried to keep my breathing steady. "Are you sure?" I pressed, keeping my tone casual, though my nerves were anything but. "Yes," she repeated, but this time her voice cracked ever so slightly. That single crack set off alarm bells in my head. Her hands were shaking more visibly now, and she was clutching at the fabric of her dress like she was trying to anchor herself to something. Against my better judgment, I pushed further. "Did something happen back there?" She finally turned to look at me, her eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't name. Fear, desperation, maybe even guilt. "Just drive," she said sharply, her voice trembling but insistent. My stomach twisted at her tone. This wasn't just fear or distress, it was panic. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't something she was ready to talk about. The rest of the drive was silent again, but it was a silence heavy with unanswered questions. My fingers gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, and my mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Whatever was going on, it wasn't as simple as picking up a stranded traveler. The tension in the car became unbearable. Her silence had shifted from unsettling to downright oppressive, and my own unease was growing with every mile. Finally, I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Look," I said, keeping my eyes on the road, "if something's wrong, you can tell me. If someone's hurt you, I can help." For a moment, I thought she wouldn't respond. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "You can't help." The way she said it sent a chill through me. It wasn't just her words. It was a finality in her voice, the utter conviction that help was beyond reach. "Why not?" I asked, my throat dry. She hesitated. and I could see her reflection in the windshield, her lips trembling as she struggled to find the words. "Because they'll find me," she said finally, her voice breaking. "No matter where I go, they'll find me. My pulse quickened. She looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her dress in a way that made me think she was trying to hold herself together. "I don't know who they are," she admitted. "They've been following me, watching me. I don't know why." The way she said it didn't sound like paranoia. It sounded like she'd been living in a nightmare, one she couldn't escape. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "Do you think they're still following you?" Her head jerked up, her eyes wide and glassy. "I know they are." A shiver ran down my spine as her words settled over me. I wanted to dismiss it as fear talking, the ramblings of someone who'd been through something traumatic. But there was something about the way she said it, like she wasn't guessing, she knew. "What do they want?" I asked cautiously. She shook her head. "I don't know. I don't think they want anything. I think they just want to see me run." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her trembling hands to her face. For a brief moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of pity for her, despite the fear gnawing at my own chest. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to reassure her, but a sudden noise cut me off. A loud thud came from behind us, like something hitting the trunk. My heart leaped into my throat as I instinctively glanced in the rearview mirror. The road was empty, but the sound had been unmistakable. She froze, her hands dropping to her lap, her face pale as a ghost. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My hands gripped the steering wheel, so tightly they began to ache. I didn't want to look in the mirror again, but I couldn't stop myself. Still nothing, just a dark, empty road stretching behind us. But I could feel it now, the oppressive weight of being watched. "Drive faster," she said suddenly, her voice urgent and full of panic. "Please, don't stop." I pressed harder on the accelerator, the car surging forward as the engine's growl filled the silence. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the faint glow of the horizon teasing the promise of safety. My hands were slick on the wheel, and my heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out every other sound. She didn't say another word. Her body was rigid, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windshield, as though she could see something I couldn't. Her fear was contagious, and every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had caused that sound. The faint outline of a crossroads appeared in the distance. Relief surged through me at the sight of a signpost, though its words were unreadable in the dim light. "Here," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharper now, urgent. "Stop here." I glanced at her, confused. "There's nothing here." "Are you sure?" "Yes," she snapped, her tone brooking no argument. "Just stop the car." Against my better judgment, I slowed and brought the car to a halt near the crossroads. The headlights illuminated the empty intersection, just a dirt path cutting across the main road, bordered by tall grass that swayed eerily in the wind. She reached for the door handle, but then hesitated, her hand trembling. She turned to me, and for the first time, I saw something close to regret in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "Wait," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "This doesn't feel right. Let me take you further. Somewhere safe?" She shook her head, her expression haunted. "This is as far as you can go." Before I could argue, she pushed the door open and stepped out. The cold night air rushed in, sending a chill down my spine. She stood there for a moment, silhouetted by the car's headlights, her figure fragile against the vastness of the night. "Are you sure?" I asked, leaning toward the open window. She turned back to me, her face pale and her eyes distant. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice flat, almost detached. The words struck me like a blow. "What do you mean?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She took a step away from the car, then another, her form disappearing into the shadows. I watched her go, my chest tight with an inexplicable dread. I glanced at the rearview mirror, then back at the road in front of me. The crossroads loomed empty and silent, yet suffocating in its stillness. When I turned to look for her again, she was gone, completely vanished. I sat there, frozen, staring into the darkness where she had disappeared. The air inside the car felt heavier now, suffocating, as if the night itself was pressing in around me. My instincts screamed at me to drive away, but I couldn't stop replaying her last words in my head. You shouldn't have stopped. A strange unease crept over me, making my skin crawl. I rolled the window up and locked the doors, my gaze darting nervously to the rearview mirror. Nothing, just the same empty road stretching behind me, silent and still. I was about to shift into gear when something caught my eye, movement in the side mirror. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, scanning the shadows beyond the car. There was nothing there. No figure, no sound. Just a faint rustle of the wind through the tall grass. But the feeling remained, that heavy, suffocating sensation of being watched. I shook my head, trying to focus. She was gone. Whatever she was running from, it was her problem now. I told myself this over and over, but it didn't make the tension in my chest go away. Then I saw it. In the rear view mirror, barely visible in the dim light, there was a figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. My blood ran cold. It wasn't her. This figure was taller, broader, and completely still. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart pounded violently as I whipped around to look, but the road was empty. A nervous laugh escaped me, shaky and hollow. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I shifted into drive and stepped on the gas, desperate to put the crossroads behind me. The tires skidded slightly on the loose gravel before catching, propelling the car forward. As I drove, the unease didn't leave. In fact, it only grew stronger, as though the darkness itself was following me. And then the radio crackled. The static burst to life, loud and jarring, cutting through the silence. I hadn't even realized the radio was on. My hand darted to turn it off, but before I could, a voice cut through the noise, distorted and faint, but unmistakably hers. You shouldn't have stopped. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My chest heaved as I stared at the radio, my hands trembling. The voice was gone now, replaced by the same static. I didn't wait to make sense of it. I pressed the gas pedal again, harder this time, and sped down the road, not daring to look in the mirror. Whatever was happening, I knew one thing for certain. I should never have stopped. The road ahead felt endless, a dark tunnel with no clear destination. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I couldn't let go. I couldn't slow down. The air inside the car felt suffocating, as though it had grown thicker with every passing mile. The radio was off now. Completely off, but I could still hear her voice in my head, repeating the same chilling words. You shouldn't have stopped. I forced myself to glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again, standing impossibly still in the middle of the road. But there was nothing, just the empty, desolate stretch of asphalt disappearing into the black void behind me. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. The road was eerily quiet now, the hum of the engine the only sound keeping me grounded. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched had crept into the car with me, silent but oppressive, refusing to leave. I tried to focus on the road, on the faint line where my headlights met the darkness, but my thoughts kept spiraling back to her. The way she appeared so suddenly, her cryptic words, the way she vanished into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. Had I imagined it? No. The thud on the car, the voice on the radio, those were real. I wasn't imagining anything. Something had happened back there, something I couldn't explain, and now it was following me. I didn't stop driving until the faint glow of a gas station sign appeared in the distance. The sight of it brought a wave of relief, though it was short-lived. I pulled into the empty lot and parked under the harsh fluorescent lights, which buzzed faintly in the stillness. For the first time since she left the car, I allowed myself to exhale. My hands trembled as I let go of the wheel, the tension in my chest loosening just enough for me to breathe again. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the gas station's cracked pavement, trying to make sense of everything. The fear, the dread, it all lingered, clawing at the edges of my mind, but I told myself it was over. But as I looked into the rear-view mirror one last time, my stomach dropped. There, in the back seat, just for a fleeting second, I thought I saw her face, pale, hollow, and staring straight at me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but the back seat was empty, completely empty. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Whatever I had encountered on that road, it wasn't gone, and it wasn't going to leave. I turned the car back onto the road, but this time, I drove with no destination, no sense of relief. Just the oppressive weight of knowing that some decisions, once made, could never be undone.